Beneath the floorboards of an old English country house called Furbank Hall, in the rolling Bedfordshire countryside where the hedgerows grew high and the summers were long and the winters smelled of wood smoke and damp wool, there lived a family of very small people who had survived for generations on a single, simple principle: take only what will not be missed. They were called the borrowers. Not thieves, that distinction mattered enormously to them, particularly to Homily, the mother, who would have been deeply offended by the comparison and said so at considerable length if you had made it. Thieves took. Borrowers borrowed. The fact that nothing was ever returned was, in the borrower's understanding of the arrangement, beside the point. Human beings, whom the borrowers called human beings, because that was the word as it had come down through generations, and no one had thought to question it, were enormous and careless and had far more of everything than they could possibly keep track of. A reel of cotton from the sewing basket. A stamp from the bureau drawer. A small cube of sugar from the kitchen larder. A thimble that had rolled behind the wainscoting. These things were not missed. They were, in the precise moral economy of the borrowers, available. The clock family, so named because their home was established in the space beneath the grandfather clock in the hallway of Furbank Hall, consisted of 3 people. Pod Clock was the father, a small, steady, methodical man with capable hands and the kind of quiet courage that expresses itself not in speeches but in the daily, practical business of doing what needs to be done. He was the borrower of the family, the one who went up through the gaps in the floorboards and across the vast open country of the kitchen floor and up the dangerous vertical ascent of the tablecloth to collect what they needed. He wore a leather vest he had fashioned from a kid glove and boots made from 2 halves of an acorn cup lined with felt, and he moved through the human world with the careful, exact efficiency of someone who has calculated the risk of every surface and every shadow and the position of every human foot. Homily was the mother, small even by borrower standards, with dark anxious eyes that missed nothing and a tongue that expressed her considerable feelings about the world at considerable length and with considerable force. She was a worrier, which in the borrower's circumstances was not entirely unreasonable, and she expressed her love for her family primarily through the intensity of her concern for their safety, which was permanent and profound and occasionally overwhelming. She kept their home beneath the clock with a housekeeper's fierce pride: cotton reel furniture, matchbox drawers, a thimble used as a cooking pot, stamps framed on the walls like artwork, a champagne cork carved into a handsome settle. It was, by any borrower's standard, a fine establishment, and Homily maintained it with the energy of someone for whom home was the most important word in the language. And then there was Ariety. Ariety Clock was 14 years old and small in the precise way that all borrowers were small, 4 inches tall, exactly proportioned, with bright dark eyes and dark hair and a quality of aliveness that expressed itself in everything she did. She was her father's daughter in her courage and her mother's daughter in her feeling, and entirely herself in the thing that distinguished her most sharply from both parents: her curiosity. Ariety wanted to know everything. She wanted to know what was beyond the floorboards, beyond the hallway, beyond the house. She wanted to know what the garden looked like from above the ground rather than through a crack in the skirting board. She had a journal, a small one, made from a fragment of blotting paper with a cover of red leather cut from a discarded bookmark, in which she wrote her thoughts in handwriting so tiny that even a human magnifying glass would have struggled to read it, and in which she recorded her questions, because there were always more questions than answers and the questions needed somewhere to live. The rule was absolute and had been absolute for as long as any borrower could remember. You did not let yourself be seen. Being seen was the end of everything. It meant uprootment, chaos, the arrival of exterminators, the destruction of the home that had taken generations to build. Every borrower child was taught this before they were taught anything else. See without being seen. Move without being heard. Take only what will not be missed. And above all, above everything, do not let the human beings know you are there. Ariety understood the rule. She simply found it, in the way of people whose nature runs directly counter to a rule, extremely difficult to follow. It was her father who first took her up. She had asked for years, had asked with the persistent, specific, carefully argued asking of someone who knows the answer she wants and intends to get it by sheer consistency. Pod had resisted for years, for the very good reason that the world above the floorboards was genuinely dangerous and Ariety was genuinely curious, which was precisely the combination most likely to go wrong. But she was 14, and she had learned the theory of borrowing thoroughly, and the time had come to learn the practice. He took her up through the gap behind the skirting board at 6 in the morning, when the house was still and the kitchen was empty and the light came in through the east window in long golden bars that turned the flagstone floor into a landscape of light and shadow. Ariety stood at the edge of the gap and looked out at the kitchen floor stretching away in every direction, each flagstone a field, each chair leg a tree, the kitchen table a distant plateau, and she felt in her chest the specific dizzying rush of the world being larger than expected and more beautiful and more terrifying simultaneously. She walked out onto the floor. It was magnificent. Every ordinary thing, the fringe of the kitchen rug, the base of the coal scuttle, the leg of the dresser with its carved detail at the base, was extraordinary from 4 inches high. The world remade itself in proportion, became a landscape of unexpected grandeur, full of texture and detail and shadow that no human passing through a kitchen at normal height would ever notice. Ariety noticed everything. She wrote furiously in her journal in the most compressed handwriting she had ever produced, trying to get it all down before she forgot. The exact quality of the morning light on the flagstones, the sound the house made at 6 in the morning, the way the coal scuttle smelled of iron and cold. Then she saw the boy. He was lying on his stomach on the doorstep at the far end of the kitchen passage, chin on his hands, watching her. Not with alarm. That was the first thing she noticed, before the panic arrived. Not with the grabbing adult urgency of a human who has found a small person and intends to do something about it. He was watching her the way you watch something beautiful and strange and unlikely, with a careful stillness that was more reverence than predation. He was about her age. He had been sent from London to stay at Furbank Hall to recover from an illness. A pale, careful boy who had spent too much of his life indoors and had about him the particular loneliness of someone more accustomed to adults than to children his own age. He had heard sounds beneath the floorboards and had been watching for days, patient as a naturalist waiting for evidence. Ariety knew she should run. Every rule she had ever been taught said to run. Instead, she stood in the kitchen passage with her journal in her hands and looked at the enormous boy lying on the doorstep, and the enormous boy lay on the doorstep and looked back at her, and neither of them moved. "I didn't mean to frighten you," the boy said, in a voice he had deliberately made very quiet. "I'm not frightened," said Ariety, which was only partially true but felt like the right thing to establish immediately. His name, it turned out, was simply the boy, in the way that borrowers referred to human beings by their category rather than their name, as a way of maintaining the necessary distance. But Ariety, who was constitutionally opposed to unnecessary distance, learned eventually that he was called James, though she used the information sparingly. What followed was the most complicated and the most important thing that had ever happened to Ariety Clock. They met in the mornings, early, when the house was quiet. She came up through the gap and he would be there, sometimes on the doorstep, sometimes sitting quietly at the edge of the kitchen passage, always still, always careful not to make sudden movements, approaching the situation with the attentiveness of someone who understood that he was the alarming one and took that responsibility seriously. He brought her things, a tiny book, a fragment of a map, a small piece of silk ribbon, not to purchase her company but because giving things to someone who had almost nothing felt like the most natural thing. Ariety received them with the mixture of gratitude and pride that characterized everything she did, always making clear that the gifts were welcome but her company was not contingent on them. He read to her from his books, holding them flat on the floor so she could follow the words herself. She read faster than he did and told him so, which he found both startling and delightful. She told him about the borrowers, about Pod's borrowing roots and Homilly's furniture and the world beneath the floorboards, and he listened with the total, serious attention of someone who has found the most interesting thing he has ever encountered and intends to waste no part of it. She asked him about the world. Not the house, the world. What was beyond the garden? What was London like from normal height? Were there other borrowers? Were there borrowers who lived outdoors, in the fields and hedgerows, as the legend suggested? She questioned him with the accumulated force of 14 years of wanting to know things she hadn't been allowed to find out, and the boy answered as fully as he could and confessed honestly when he didn't know, which she respected. She told him about her journal, not showing it, but describing it, which was its own form of trust. She told him about the questions she kept there. He told her about the books he read, the ones that were full of worlds beyond the ordinary world, and she felt the kinship of it, the fellow feeling of two people for whom the visible world has never quite been sufficient. Meanwhile, beneath the floorboards, trouble was building. Pod had seen the boy that first morning, had arrived at the gap in the skirting board just in time to see Ingenuity standing in the kitchen passage talking to an enormous human child, which was precisely everything he had spent 14 years preventing. He had taken her home in silence, which was worse than shouting, and there had been a family conversation that was uncomfortable for everyone. Homily had expressed her feelings about the situation with her full characteristic force and at considerable length. Ingenuity had listened respectfully and argued her case with careful precision and changed nobody's mind and gone back to her journal and written down everything she was thinking, which was her method of managing situations that could not yet be resolved. But Pod had also seen something else. He had seen the way the boy looked at Ingenuity, not with the grabbing, possessive alarm of a child who has found a curiosity and wants to keep it, but with genuine care. He had seen the boy's stillness and his carefulness, his deliberate quiet, the way he held his body so as not to alarm. Pod was a quiet and methodical man, but he was not an unobservant one. He said nothing about this. But he stopped talking about moving. Moving was the borrower's ultimate resort, the extreme measure taken when a family had been seen and the safety of the home was compromised. It meant abandoning everything that had been built and accumulated, carrying only what could be carried on 4-inch bodies across open country, finding a new place and beginning again. Pod had begun, after the morning of the doorstep, to make contingency preparations for moving. He had assembled a small pack. He had surveyed the possible routes to the outdoors. Then he had watched the boy for a week, from the safety of cracks and gaps, and seen what he saw. The threat to the Clock family did not, in the end, come from the boy. It came from where threats to private, hidden things usually come from someone who looked where she should not have looked and reported what she found without sufficient thought for the consequences. Mrs. Driver, the cook at Furbank Hall, had eyes that were constitutionally suspicious of anything that seemed to be going better than it should, and she had noticed for months that small things went missing from the kitchen in patterns that did not match Rats, too selective, too specific, too seemingly purposeful. She had set herself to finding the explanation with the grim determination of a woman who has decided something is wrong and intends to be proven right. She found them. Not through cleverness, exactly, more through patience and spite, which are sometimes a functional substitute. She found the gap in the skirting board and confirmed her suspicions and told the groundskeeper, and the groundskeeper told the exterminator, and the wheels of the human world began turning in the particular unstoppable way they turn when someone large has decided to deal with something small. Ingenuity found out from the boy, who was white-faced and urgent in the morning passage, and told her everything he knew and everything he had overheard, and she received the information with a stillness that she did not entirely feel but imposed on herself because stillness was what the situation required. Then she went home and told her parents, and watched her mother's face go through its full terrible range of feeling. The fear and the sorrow and the controlled panic, the looking around at the home she had built over decades, the matchbox drawers and the stamp-framed walls and the champagne cork settle, and felt something in herself go very quiet and very clear. "We have to go," she said. "Tonight. Before they come." "Everything," said Homily, meaning, "we'll have to leave everything." "Almost everything," Ingenuity said. She was already thinking, already running through what she had learned from the boys' books and her own observations and the questions in her journal that had, over the months, accumulated their own partial answers. She was thinking about the field beyond the garden wall and the stories of the borrowers who lived outdoors, the Hendreries and others, and the drainage pipe she had noticed at the edge of the kitchen garden that led, if her calculations were correct, to the open hedgerow beyond the ha-ha. "I know a way out," she said. Pod looked at her. He had known for 14 years that this day would come, not this specific day, but some version of it. The day when Ingenuity's particular combination of curiosity and courage and careful observation would be needed for something more than filling a journal. He had been preparing her for it, in the way that good parents prepare children for things without telling them that's what they're doing, by taking her up and teaching her the borrowing routes and letting her look and letting her question. "Show me," he said. She showed him. She had not borrowed the knowledge of the drain pipe from a book or from the boy. She had found it herself, on one of the early mornings, following her own instinct along the kitchen garden wall. She had measured the diameter of the pipe against her own height and calculated the passage and noted the direction and written it in her journal under a question that had, over months, quietly become an answer. Where does the outside start? The answer was, here. They packed in 2 hours, working with the focused efficiency of people who have always known, at some level, that this moment would require them to be ready. Homily packed with her jaw set and her eyes dry, making her selections with a ruthlessness born of necessity, touching things she left behind with a brevity that was its own form of grief. Pod packed the tools and the practical things. Ingenuity packed her journal and the small book the boy had given her and 3 things of her own choosing that she did not explain and did not need to. The boy was at the gap in the skirting board when they emerged. He had come in the night to help, had set out a path of careful guiding objects, a handkerchief spread to mark the safe passage across the kitchen floor, a small lamp placed where it lit the route without exposing them. He had thought of it himself, with the specific ingenuity of someone who cannot do the thing that needs doing himself but can make it easier for the person who can. Ingenuity looked up at him from the kitchen floor. He was enormous above her in the low lamplight, but not frightening, had not been frightening for months, had ceased to be the alarming thing and become simply James, the lonely boy who read books flat on the floor so she could follow the words. "Will you be all right?" he said, very quietly. "Yes," she said. She thought about the journal and the questions in it, and the answers that had come from curiosity and cleverness and paying attention and refusing to be only as small as her circumstances suggested. "We're good at being all right." He put his hand flat on the kitchen floor, palm up, not to catch or hold, just to offer. She stepped onto it, felt the warmth of it for one moment, and then stepped off onto the handkerchief path, and her family followed, and they crossed the kitchen floor in the quiet dark and found the drainage pipe at the kitchen garden wall exactly where Ingenuity had calculated it would be. The pipe was dark and narrow and smelled of earth and cold water and lead, with a slight downward gradient, toward the open air. Ingenuity went first. She walked through the dark with her hand on the curved wall of the pipe, counting her steps the way she had always counted things, turning the unknown into something she could navigate by turning it into numbers. She emerged into cold night air and stood on the damp earth at the edge of a hedgerow and looked up at more stars than she had ever seen in her life. The sky above Furbank Hall was clear and enormous and full of stars whose names she did not know but intended to learn, and the hedgerow stretched away to the left and right full of small sounds and small movements that she identified, systematically, as leaves and insects and a small mammal whose specific variety she could not yet determine. Pod and Homily came through the pipe behind her. They stood in the cold air and looked at the open world. Homily looked at the stars and the field and the hedgerow and the vast, uncontrolled, unprotected outside, and she said nothing for a long moment, which was itself remarkable. Then she said, quietly, "Well." "Yes," said Pod. "It's very large," Homily said. "It is," Pod agreed. Ingenuity was already writing in her journal. Not frantically, but steadily, the way she always wrote when the thing she was writing mattered most. She was writing the name of the field as she would call it. She was writing the direction from which they'd come and the direction in which they would go. She was writing the first question of the new chapter, which was, what is out here that we don't know yet? She looked up from the journal at the enormous sky. The answer was, everything. They walked into the hedgerow together, Pod in front, Homily in the middle, Ingenuity behind with her journal under her arm and her eyes wide open and her mind already moving through the new questions that the new world was presenting, one after another, in the particular abundance that the world offers to anyone who is paying proper attention. They were small. The world was enormous. The world had always been enormous, and they had always been small, and the smallness had never been the problem, had never been a limitation at all, properly understood. The problem, if there was one, was thinking that small meant helpless. It did not. It had never meant that. Small, in the right hands, in clever hands, in curious hands, in hands that held a journal full of questions and a mind full of answers, was simply another word for precise. For careful. For attentive to the details that large things missed. For finding the route through the pipe that nobody else had thought to look for. For surviving and building and making a home and then, when the home was threatened, for finding the door in the wall that the frightened and the comfortable and the incurious would never have known was there. Arriety Clock walked into the wide world with her family beside her and her journal in her hands, and every question she had ever asked moving through her like a kind of light, illuminating the way forward the way that good questions always do. She was 4 inches tall, and she was brave, and she was clever, and she was curious, and the world, vast, uncharted, full of unknown things in every direction, was entirely ready to be known.